You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains discussions of sexual assault, murder, and child abuse. Listener discretion is advised.
It's Boxing Day 1964, when a 26-year-old man named Ian Brady and a 22-year-old woman named Myra Hindley attend a fair in Ancoats, an area in Manchester, northwest England. The pair had met 3 years prior, when Myra had developed an infatuation with Ian. Finally, Ian showed interest and asked her to the movies. They've been inseparable ever since, although their relationship is anything but conventional. While at the fair, the couple notice that a 10-year-old named Lesley Ann Downey appears to be alone. In an instant, she becomes their next target. The young couple approach her, purposefully dropping the shopping they're carrying. Ian and Myra know that the presence of a woman means a child is more likely to trust them. This is part of their strategy. And so, they ask Lesley if she wouldn't mind helping them carry their packages to their car and then onto their home on Wardle Brook Avenue. When they arrive, Lesley Ann Downey is raped and then murdered. She is not Ian and Myra's first victim, and she will not be their last. The following morning, as Lesley Ann's family frantically search for their missing daughter, the pair bury her in a shallow grave at Saddleworth Moor, a wide-open expanse of hills and uncultivated land. Her clothes are buried by her feet. The crimes committed by Myra Hindley and Ian Brady would come to be known as the Moors Murders, a series of killings that targeted children, 4 of whom were sexually assaulted. Myra Hindley has long been branded the most evil woman in Britain, the exception to everything we think we know about female killers. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. And this month, we're looking specifically at women who kill. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Lizzie Seal and Dr. Megan Sachs. Lizzie is an expert in criminology from Sussex University in Brighton, and also the author of multiple educational texts, including Women, Murder and Femininity, Gender Representations of Women Who Kill. Megan is an Associate Professor of Criminology at Fairleigh Dickinson University and co-host of the Women and Crime podcast. Lizzie, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady worked together at an electrical engineering company. Was that how they met, and what was the beginning of their relationship like?
So Myra Hindley worked at the firm as a typist, basically, and then Ian Brady worked more he wasn't like a sort of qualified engineer in that sense, but he worked for the engineering firm. When she reflected on her past later in life, Myra Hindley said, she just was kind of immediately attracted to him. I think she thought he was a little bit different, that kind of thing.
And Ian Brady had a criminal history, but at that point, Myra Hindley didn't. What do we know about her upbringing and her childhood?
I think as far as we know, Myra Hindley's upbringing and childhood was fairly normal for a working class girl in Manchester in the era. She went to live with her grandmother. And again, when she has wrote about her life or spoke about her life when she was older, she wrote about being a physically abused by her father. So that's something that she highlighted as something that was sort of significant about her upbringing. But in terms of her background, sort of in terms of social class, life experience, stuff like that, I suppose it's kind of fairly typical for the era for a sort of young working class girl.
And their relationship was unusual, with Brady sort of giving Hindley Nazi literature to read, and their interests were not typical of a young couple. What drew them to that kind of material?
I mean, I don't know what drew them to that kind of material, but I would say it's because they were interested in ideas and literature that were understood to be transgressive. Obviously, Nazi literature is still perceived to be very transgressive, but I suppose in the context of the 1960s, when the war was still very present in people's lives, in lots and lots of people's living memory, of course, you know, there was a transgressive appeal to Nazism and Nazi literature. And I guess some of the other literature they were interested in also sort of fitted that. So I suppose it's an attraction to, you know, the forbidden, the transgressive, that can seem to reaffirm your sense of maybe intellectual superiority or specialness or something like that. And although I suppose that probably was in many ways quite unusual, I imagine they probably weren't by any means the only young people at the time who found some kind of attraction to transgression and the type of escape that seems to present. But of course, those other people didn't go on to murder children. But I think that would have been the appeal of stuff like, you know, Nazi literature and that kind of thing.
Were they outcasts? How were they viewed by the people around them? Were they unusual people?
I think people perhaps did find Ian Brady to be, yes, maybe somebody who was seen as unusual. As far as I understand it, Myra Hindley, not really. I mean, you know, she might have had times where she hadn't got on with people, family members and so forth. But as far as I know, she wasn't seen as particularly unusual.
And it was 1963 when Brady told Hindley he wanted to commit the perfect murder. What did they do that day, Megan?
Right. So on this day, Ian and Myra went out essentially to scout their first victim, and they were traveling in separate vehicles. And Ian kind of signaled to Myra, like, you know, behind her with a flash of, you know, this is the victim. And Myra saw Pauline Reed walking on the street. Pauline was, she was just 16. She just left her house to go to her first dance. She was going to meet up with her friends. I mean, her mother described her outfit and how happy she was. And this was supposed to be a wonderful night. But unfortunately, Myra Hindley would see Pauline, and at Ian's, you know, behest, she coaxed Pauline into her vehicle. And this wasn't that hard for Myra because she knew Pauline. And so she concocted this kind of story. I've lost some expensive glove. I really need some help looking for it. She was distraught. Pauline, being a sweet girl that she was, got in the car with Myra, having no idea what was really in front of her. And then essentially Myra drove somewhere out into the moors to meet up with Ian Brady. Unfortunately, this was Pauline's doom. Ian sexually assaulted her, reportedly. He slashed her throat. And according to Ian and Myra, Myra was just there to help clean up the scene. I will say that story did change later on, but according to them at first, Myra was just a lookout and she was the lure and she was the accomplice, but not the person who actually perpetrated the heinous crime.
And Lizzie, in the context of that time, was the fact that Myra, who was doing the luring, was a woman the reason why these children would have trusted her?
Yes, and I'm sure they did. I mean, I think you've got a mixture of things in the era of the time. children and young people would have been out and about without adult supervision much more than tends to be the case now. But I think, yes, people, children included, are more trusting of women, and generally you aren't warned about women as strangers. So I think it was probably less likely that children were quite so conscious of what in a slightly later era became termed stranger danger anyway in the 1960s. But even so, yes, they would have been more trusting of or more comfortable with approaching, speaking to a woman they didn't know than a man they didn't know. And I suppose that's one of the things that's been quite key about what people found shocking about Myra Hindley's involvement sort of around the time that it emerged and, you know, in subsequent years as well.
It was a few months after Pauline Reed's death before they struck again, this time targeting a 12-year-old named John Kilbride. In terms of the violence, does that look again like it was executed by Brady rather than Hindley?
In Kilbride's case, it does look like it was perpetrated, the actual violent act and the murder was perpetrated solely by Brady. And I don't think that he really disputed her involvement in this one. They seem to have similar stories in that they both said that, again, she was part of the lure. She helped, to obtain this victim for, Brady's pleasure. And then she was also part of the aftermath. But I don't believe that Hindley actually perpetrated the assault or the murder. And I don't think that Brady really disputed this on this particular victim. Which maybe, if you think about it, might lend some credence to the fact that, Brady said that Myra had participated in the assault against Pauline. Why would he say that for Pauline, but not for John Kilbride? So you might look at this as lending some credibility to Brady's version of events.
12-year-old Keith Bennett was killed in much the same way in June 1964, but things seemed to change for 10-year-old Lesley Ann Downey. They actually took her back to their house, didn't they?
Yes, young Lesley was at a fair, and she was lured to the car of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley by the promise of some type of reward for helping them carry some bags. And in this one, the pair got more brazen because they did take Lesley Ann Downey to their home, which does make this different. Lesley, unfortunately, like the other children, they're all unfortunate stories. She was bound, she was gagged, she was undressed, she was sexually assaulted, photographed by Brady and Hindley, and then strangled by Ian Brady ultimately. And then they, as they always did, they took her body to the moors, which is where they deposited, other bodies, or where they got rid of, what they would look as their remains. But this is very different, bringing someone to your home. It has two kind of indications. One is that they're feeling more comfortable. We can get away with this now. We can sort of do what we want. They're feeling more brazen after each kill. But the second indicator on the same hand is that this is sloppier in terms of the fact that now they're bringing someone to the home, which will leave evidence in their home. So it's a weird binary.
Their last murder was of Edward Evans, and Ian chose to get Myra Hindley's brother-in-law involved. His name was David Smith. How did it all come undone for the pair?
So Brady thought that he could recruit David Smith. David Smith was younger, and Brady thought that he was sort of grooming him for this lifestyle to participate with him. And I'm not really clear why he thought that, he would be grooming him for murder. That's quite a stretch. However, what happened was that Ian Brady had invited a 17-year-old Edward Evans into his home, and he murdered him in the home in front of David Smith. And this was a very brutal scene, by the way. He had hit him with a hatchet. He strangled him. He did all of this in front of Smith. And Smith reported being absolutely terrified. And he was afraid that Brady would turn violent against him. So he helped clean up the mess. And according to some reports, there was a discussion between Brady and Hindley, like this was the messiest one yet. So David Smith helped clean up, but he left after, totally terrified, went home to Maureen, who was Myra's sister, told her what happened, and the two of them ran out and called, I guess it's 999, they called emergency services, and reported this incident immediately. And the police interviewed him, and this is really where their house of cards began to fall. So the police took this report very seriously, and they went to visit Ian Brady and Myra Hindley's home. And Ian and Myra allowed them access to the home. And when they went inside, they discovered that there was a locked bedroom, and they asked for access and were granted it. And in that locked bedroom, they found the body of 17-year-old Edward Evans. And this is really where things pushed into high gear. Now they have a body, they have differing explanations from Ian and David, but now they start to see that these two, Ian and Myra, are probably involved in something, very gruesome.
Were they able to find any other evidence tying them to other murders?
Yes, they were. They found the body, which was the initial finding. Obviously, they knew they had one gruesome murder here. But also, David Smith had told them about them having some luggage somewhere, suitcases that might have contained some incriminating evidence, because he heard this in the home. And so the police were able to actually track this luggage. I don't know if they found it was like a slip or a ticket for luggage storage, and they went and they were able to find suitcases that belonged to Ian and Myra. And in those suitcases, they found some very damning evidence. Essentially, they found photographs and tapes made of the torture of Lesley Ann. I mean, this was very, very graphic. The officers who described it said that they were crying when they heard it. Apparently, Lesley had cried out for her mother and, oh my gosh, and prayed. And this was a very upsetting and very distressing tape from a child who was being tortured and praying and hoping someone would come. And it was about 16 minutes long. So they had all this evidence that tied them to Lesley. And there were also a lot of photos on the moors in certain areas. And the police began to understand that this might be where they were depositing or, dumping their victims. There was also a diary by Hindley. There were some entries that she had written about John Gilbride, if I'm correct. And so they definitely started to amass evidence to suggest that the two were involved in multiple murders.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with criminology experts Dr. Lizzie Seal and Dr. Megan Sachs about the life and crimes of Myra Hindley. When they arrested Hindley and Brady, were they both sort of charged with the same crime, or were they looking at Hindley as more of an accessory?
Well, first, they were not charged with all of the crimes. They were charged with 3. So what they were charged with was, the murders of Lesley Ann Downey, John Gilbride, and Edward Evans. Ian was charged primarily with these 3 murders. And then Myra was charged with the murder of Lesley Ann Downey and Edward Evans, and to being an accessory to the murder of John Gilbride. I think that the assumption was at first that Myra was an accessory, but she was charged somewhat equally, with the exception of the 3rd murder. As I said, John Gilbride. In that one, she just was charged as an accessory.
So she was initially sort of considered an accessory. And when they sat down with police and began talking about what had happened, was she cooperative with police in terms of where they had buried the bodies, in terms of what had actually happened?
Not initially. So neither Ian or Myra was really cooperative initially, Myra maintained her innocence for many years. And even though Ian had tried to convince Myra, he tried to protect her. He wrote to her giving her ideas, how she could distance herself from him. But Myra wasn't having it. There was solidarity in the beginning. There was a proclamation of innocence. It wasn't really until much later on, after convictions, that Myra changed her tune.
How did that story change over the years in terms of Myra's involvement?
It didn't change until after the two were apprehended and they stood trial and they were convicted. During the time of the trial, they pretty much stood in solidarity. They supported each other. They didn't turn on each other, which, by the way, is not common because oftentimes people will turn on each other for a better deal. However, after the two were convicted, a couple of years after, I would say, Myra was really first to say that she was the victim of Ian and that she was a victim of him, that he assaulted her, that he threatened her, that she was totally terrified, and that she was, his accomplice because she was forced to be and she was afraid for her life. And, then Ian would respond by saying that Myra was actually more of a participant in the sexual assault of Pauline and some of the other victims in response. So we don't know what the real truth is. It would be hard to decipher at this point.
The narrative of Myra being a victim of Ian has imprinted itself on the case. Is that how you see it, Lizzie, or is that what we tend to do to women who commit crimes?
I think it's definitely a recurrent story about if women have been involved in, and it is, of course, unusual, but if women have been involved in sort of shocking or unusual murders with a man, and usually the man is, a partner, a boyfriend. I have written about how there's a kind of dual perception. One side of it is that the woman is seen as being sort of under the man's control, maybe via abuse and coercion, or maybe via, infatuation and so forth. And the other sort of side of the equation is that the woman is perceived as somehow being kind of the mastermind of the whole thing. So they might not be understood to be the one who, was the more physically violent party or whatever, but will be perceived as having some kind of, cunning power, and that actually they're the one somewhat in control of the man. And I think both of those understandings rely on very long-standing stereotypes about kind of womanhood and femininity. One is about women's weakness or subjection to control, and one is about a sort of misogynistic stereotype about malign feminine power. Coming back to the Brady and Hindley case specifically, again, as far as I understand it, the explanation that Myra Hindley might have been, abused or afraid of Ian Brady is something that was raised quite many years after the actual trial, and that this was something she sort of spoke about in subsequent years. At the time, I don't think people so much perceived that maybe she'd been mistreated by Ian Brady, but there was a perception that he was the one in control, and the trial judge kind of commented, that he was the sort of the dominant one, and that Myra Hindley was probably someone who could change and Ian Brady was someone who probably couldn't. But Myra Hindley, I would say, has definitely been seen in both ways as a kind of cruel mastermind. That was definitely quite a strong stereotype about her, which I think grew stronger in the decades following the Moors murders. And if people were, let's say, somewhat more sympathetic towards her, which she didn't actually have that many people who were sympathetic towards her, but I think, yes, they would have been more likely to have seen her as not being fully responsible. And obviously their roles in the crimes were different, but I think that interpreting it is always kind of beset by the types of stereotypes that exist.
I wonder if people were almost more horrified by Hindley's involvement because she was a woman, because we have a sense of the maternal caring role, that there's this bamboozlement almost that a woman could somehow be involved in crimes of this gravity. Was that another cultural conversation that went on?
Yes, definitely. And I think that is what defined Myra Hindley, that the crimes were seen as being almost the most shocking crimes that a woman could participate in. And as we have spoken about, the kind of phenomenon of being seen to kind of lure children and young people as a woman who's perceived as being less threatening, more maternal, and all of that, that was something that definitely sort of shaped portrayals of Myra Hindley. But she's been described in sort of analyses of how she was understood culturally as being like a sort of anti-mother, because, she was seen as being the opposite of, nurturing, caring for children, all of that. And that's where the portrayals of Myra Hindley as somebody who perhaps was monstrous rather than human derived from, because there was a desire, I suppose, to put her into a different realm, to try to make her someone who wasn't basically quite an ordinary woman who'd been involved in something that was very shocking and unusual, but as somebody who, if she had been involved in these crimes, must therefore be monstrous and sort of not really a woman, not really human.
Did they ever provide insight into what their motivation was? Were these sexually motivated crimes? Were they, motivated primarily by a desire to enact extreme violence? What sort of insights did we get from them?
The insights we got from Myra were not that helpful. I think what we know from Myra is that she just claimed that she was going at the behest of Ian. She had fallen in love with him and then was his victim as well. She was manipulated and whatnot. Ian Brady certainly was sexually motivated, but he was also motivated by the same sexual gratification through pain and torture. He was definitely or very, very clearly diagnosed with psychopathy and other mental illnesses, or I should say other mental disorders later on. So I think that Ian was the primary motivator here in terms of he wanted to perpetrate these. This was his fantasy. He wanted to commit these crimes for sexual gratification, and he enjoyed torture and pain. Now, did Myra share the same, affliction? Probably not initially, to be honest. I think Myra initially began because she wanted Ian and she wanted to please him. Although I should be clear to say that Myra definitely shows signs of antisocial behavior as well.
I suppose that's the question, isn't it? Whether Hindley would have committed these sorts of crimes or been an accomplice if she had never met Brady. Because as you say, he was, diagnosed as a psychopath, whereas her mental diagnosis is a little bit more ambiguous. What do you think? Do you think that if she'd never met him, she might have lived a very, very different life?
This is such a great question, and it's one of the most interesting questions of this case, right? What I can tell you about Myra is that she has primary traits of antisocial behavior. She has the lack of empathy. She's manipulative. She lies. She has a need for stimulation. So in many ways, she does fit antisocial personality. However, if she had not met Ian, would she have perpetrated such heinous, brutal crimes? I'm going to say this was a perfect storm. I don't think that she would have wound up being a serial murderer if she didn't meet someone who had, full-blown psychopathy, we might say. However, that being said, I think Myra was antisocial, and I think she still would have committed crimes or otherwise very malicious acts, if that makes sense.
Their relationship appeared to sort of strengthen through the crimes they committed. When they were eventually charged and sentenced. What happened to their relationship? Did they stay in contact while they were both imprisoned?
They did for a few years, but then not, basically. So Myra Hindley died in 2002, but by then, I think she hadn't been in contact with Ian Brady for sort of 30 plus years.
Did she have any other relationships towards the end of her life?
She had at least one relationship with a prison warden and attempted or had a sort of escape plot as part of that. So that was in the 70s. And she had sort of friendships, I guess, with people from outside of prison who were kind of supporters of her.
What can you tell us about Myra Hindley's final years that she spent in prison?
Myra's last years were spent maintaining her innocence. She went on a campaign. She said that it was Ian, that she was the victim. But she also, did confess several years later to committing more crimes. She confessed to the crimes for which she was not convicted. And to be honest, the police looked at her as sort of helpful at this point. Myra began to help the police several years after her conviction. It was actually in response to Keith Bennett's mother writing to her, one of the victims, and pleading with her and asking, please, where is my son? Please help us. At this point, Myra had been incarcerated for a number of years. She had broken off her contact with Ian, and she had been a model inmate who had advocated for her own release. So at this point, there are still two missing victims. The police have never recovered Pauline and Keith. And obviously, their families really wanted their remains. So Myra would help to find them, and she would actually be pretty helpful. I believe that Myra's description led to the recovery of Pauline Reed's body. Brady was not as helpful, just so you know. But Myra, even though she was helpful, some had said maybe she had a change of, her conscience kicked in and she changed. I think she was just trying to help herself and get out early if possible. Unfortunately, that would never happen. Myra died in prison at the age of 60 after serious respiratory failure. But she did, I would like to point out again, she did at least help police in recovering Pauline Reed's body, which would never probably have happened without her help.
And how about Brady in prison? Did he cooperate with families or with police in terms of recovering these bodies?
Brady was difficult, notoriously difficult. He would only discuss two of the murders. He would discuss Pauline and Keith. Why? I'm not quite sure. He would not allow police to take notes. He seemed to have this need for control, which makes sense. It fits. He dictated the course of, actions, how police would gather information, what information he would give. He promised to help the police find the remains, but always according to his conditions and his terms. He was also diagnosed as being chronically psychotic later on and suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. This diagnosis came very long after Myra had died. I think it was about in the 1980s, maybe 1985. After he'd gone on a long hunger strike, he actually had to be forced fed from a tube. So even though Ian Brady said that he would help steer the police towards bodies and help find them, they never really had any luck with him. And I don't think anyone was ever really sure that he really wanted to help. Ian Brady died eventually in prison at the age of 79, having never been very helpful to authorities at all.
And how do you think gender has played a role in how we've culturally interpreted the crimes of Myra Hindley?
I think it's been absolutely central because Myra Hindley was not all of her life, obviously, her life since the crimes until she died, or since the trial until she died, was basically an icon of feminine evil. That's how she's sort of been described, understood. She was perceived as monstrous. She was perceived as having kind of contravened nurturing femininity. And I'm in my mid-40s, and in the 1980s, and the 90s, I think it would be fair to say, Myra Hindley was still very well known, and she was still very much part of popular culture. She was in the tabloid press a lot for various reasons, because I suppose stories about her sold papers. And although the Moors murders had happened, in the mid-1960s, I knew who Hindley and Brady were. I'd heard of the Moors murders. I knew who Myra Hindley was. I knew she was in prison, that she wanted to be released, all that stuff. I think now young people perhaps wouldn't know who Myra Hindley was, although I think some of them do, because sometimes I do ask my classes who I teach. But she has now been dead for pretty much 20 years. And she was much more talked about and much more frequently visually represented, with a very famous photograph of her taken by the police, than Ian Brady was. And that's the other significant thing in terms of gender, in that Myra Hindley was, much more discussed, much more depicted visually. And I have had students say, when I've asked if they've heard of the Moors murders, do they know who Myra Hindley and Ian Brady are, I have had some students say, I didn't actually realise there was a man involved as well, because I'd heard of Myra Hindley and I knew she was a murderer, but I didn't know that there was also a man involved. So I think even that in itself is quite revealing about how these murders, which in themselves, of course, are tragic and awful, but how in the sort of popular imagination, the popular memory, Myra Hindley is the one who sort of is the bigger character, and that's because she was a woman.
Dr. Lizzie Seal is a senior lecturer in sociology and criminology at the University of Sussex. Her book, Women, Murder and Femininity, uses Myra Hindley as a case study of gender representations of women who kill. Dr. Megan Sachs is an associate professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University, where she teaches classes on women and crime, serial killers and crime policy. She has published her work in several journal articles and periodicals, co-authored 2 books, and contributed to several more. She also co-hosts the Women and Crime podcast. You can find a link in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. In the month of September, True Crime Conversations is doing a capsule series on women who kill. Next week, we will continue to explore the questions of what motivates female killers and how our culture attempts to make sense of them. If you want to hear more from me in the meantime, you can find me on Mamamia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as our new podcast, Cancelled, about who's in, who's out, and who cares in the world of celebrities.